Hello, my name is Mike. This is a bike. Well, it's part of a bike. There's no frame, no wheels, no handlebars. But this is the most important part. This is what puts the motor in motorcycle. This is a 2000 model year V92C engine that I purchased on eBay, and it's got a blown transmission. But that's on purpose. You see, I bought this engine knowing the transmission was bad because I want to show you guys all about the update and the upgrade, rather, that the earlier V92s require to make their transmissions bulletproof. There's actually a couple of updates, and we'll talk about both of them. This one requires the first update, which is kind of a major transmission overhaul. I'm an expert. I've done it millions of times. And so therefore I know more about it than anybody else on the internet. And I'm also a liar. Look guys, as I go through this video, if you see anything that I'm doing that you don't think is right, because I know some of you guys out there are like engineers or used to work for Victory or something like that, feel free to, type it in the comment section so that way I can ignore it. Yeah, if I make a mistake, I'll find out the hard way. It'll blow up on me or something. Anyway, I've done several of these. First one I did, I got a hold of Ryland Voss at the Vic shop, talked to him quite a bit. He was able to fax me over the instruction sheet that broke all the procedures down, gave me all the part numbers of all the stuff I needed to do. And like I said, I've done like half a dozen of these so far and never had a problem. They've all worked out really, really well. So I'm going to walk you guys through it so that you won't be afraid to do it yourself if you choose to do so. Probably the biggest problem is finding parts. Used to be a kit available. It's about $3,000 for the kit. Well, they discontinued the kit, so now you got to source the parts individually. And we'll talk about that too. Some of them are easy to get. You can find them used on eBay pretty cheap. And then other parts, well, they're obsolete. You really got to hunt to find them. So we'll talk about all that stuff. So stick around.
Somewhere in a dusty, dirty back alley in western Arizona, not far from historic Route 66, is an old fart trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. He'll work on anything, just as long as it's got at least 2 cool wheels.
Of course, the first question asked usually is, well, how do I know if my V92C has already had any of the transmission upgrades? So there's a couple of upgrades. The first one entails completely going through the transmission case, replacing the gear set, the shift components, all the shift components, the shift drum, the shift forks, all that sort of stuff. And because the gears are different, the larger diameter gear is no longer in the same location, and so the original speed sensor could no longer see it. So a new speed sensor has to be mounted to the engine case. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So on this engine, this transmission. This one has not had the upgrade. The place I purchased it from removed the speed sensor from this opening here, and they wedged a little bit of stuff in here. Anyway, the original location of the speed sensor was right here, and it was held with a little kind of a forked doohickey and a bolt. And that was fine because the largest diameter gear was like right in this location, and as the output shaft spun, that sensor could see the gear teeth, and it could count the gear teeth, and it would determine how fast the bike was going. Now, as part of the upgrade, the gears are in different locations inside the case, and so in order for the speedometer to know how fast the bike was going, a sensor bracket is mounted here to this engine case, and it reads the teeth on the output sprocket. So that's the easiest way to tell. Let me show you on my bikes. So here we have an early bike. This is one of the numbered bikes. If we look right down here, on the output sprocket, you can see a sensor bolted to a bracket. That will register and tell the speedometer how fast the bike is going. And once again, I don't know if you can see it too good here, but anyway, there is a speed sensor. You can see the bolt head, if nothing else. So both of these early bikes had that transmission upgrade done in them. Later engines, such as this Freedom 100 here in the Jackpot, well, there is now a sensor back on top of the transmission like there used to be, and there's no longer a reason to mount a sensor back here on the gear, so don't let it confuse you. What we're talking about here refers to only the early production bikes that use what they nicknamed the hammer engine. And if you look at the hammer engine, well, the fins and the jugs and the valve covers are completely different than those of a Freedom engine. So they're pretty easy to identify the early motors from the later motors. Now, even with the complete redoing of the gear set in these transmissions, they were still having some trouble. They did all those upgrades and people were still having problems. And what they found was, even with the more modern updated gear set, which by the way is the one they ended up using all the way up till like 2005 in the 5 speeds, they were still having a problem with occasionally third gear going out. And what they found was that some of the gears were not hardened properly. So even if you took your Victory in, you had the upgrade done, they split the case, they put all the new gear sets and all the new shift components, new lubrication channels, all the stuff that has to be done, and then you still lost third gear. So in order to avoid that, what the next recall is, well, they would look closely at the output shaft, and they would look for a stamped-in number. And certain series they could identify as being the ones prone to having a problem with that soft gear, if you will. And the solution to that was actually a lot simpler. Instead of having to go back in there and go through the transmission another time, they simply did this. So this is like the drive sprocket that would typically be on the bike, and you can see 5 bolt holes hold it to the hub of the wheel. Well, what they did is they went to something called a cush drive, and that's this fancy chrome one here. It looks pretty, but it's a little bit different in construction. You'll notice there's no bolt holes apparent right there. Come on out of there. And that is because it is a two-piece, can't even see it. That's because it is a two-piece sprocket. So you can see this portion of it here can be bolted to the hub, and this would go and cause the wheel to turn, and then this piece simply slides over it with these rubber cushions, hence the name cush drive. The idea being that is if you dump the clutch too hard or accelerated too hard, instead of tearing up the gear teeth inside the transmission, that sudden inertia or force would be dampened before it reached the wheels on the ground, therefore lessening the impact to those gear teeth and absorbing it right there. So that was the next update that they came out with. So if you see a bike running around with one of these cush drives on it, well, you might want to put this one back on. I would recommend against it. You probably want to keep the cush drive on there because, well, that one has been identified with having one of the gears that was prone to damage. Now, personally, every time I build a bike, I put this sprocket on. And you might ask, well, why would you do that? Didn't I just say it was not a good idea? Well, I think they look better. And besides, if I happen to get a bike, and I haven't checked numbers on my output shaft, if I happen to get a bike that has that problematic set of gears and it tears up third gear, well, I do this. I tear it apart and I'll put a gear set in it. So I've been rat-holing parts, having gotten a list of parts that I need to do this. I've been kind of rounding them up. I look on eBay, Craigslist, so on and so forth. When I go and do my usual eBay searches, I've got this long list of Victory part numbers, and I've collected quite a few parts. I've got enough to do a couple more of these, but those parts are getting harder and harder to find. The actual gear set itself, you can get those on eBay for $200 or $300, and usually the guys that are parting the bikes out will include the shift drum, the shift forks, all those other components that you have to have as well. Okay, so without too much further ado, we're going to tear into this bad boy. I'm not going to go into the specifics of getting the engine out. This video is going to assume you've already got it out and on your bench already. We're going to take the jugs and the heads off. We're going to set them in a cart. We're going to split the case. We're going to get inside there, and I'll show you what has to be changed. And there's a couple of minor mods that need to be done to some of the engine cases, but not all of them.
Well, we found the culprit. It's exactly what I expected. What I didn't expect was that the transmission gears are actually in pretty good shape. There's not a lot of metal and stuff all throughout the system like I've seen on so many others. So evidently when the tranny went out in this one, the guy just stopped riding it. Let me show you what I found. Just come on and have a look over here a little closer. Bring us in so you guys can see what we're after. Ow. So I took all the tranny components out, including the shift drum. Now, if you look here, there's a little retainer, and there's two broken screw heads. Some of the early ones didn't even have this retainer. Some of the earlier ones, they just had two little screws, and the heads of the screws is all that held that bearing in. And if you look at that bearing, you can see it's actually above the flush surface of this case. So what happens is, for whatever reason, there's too much load on these screws and they usually break. This bearing will actually walk out, causing the shift drum to move. Shift drum. As you can see, there's little slots, you might call them cams. Basically, when you shift gears, you rotate that little star wheel, and then the shift drum rotates, and then your shift forks have a little peg, and that peg rides in the groove, and as that drum moves, as it rides through that slot, as you can see, it will, as it rotates, it's going to change its position. It's going to cause this shift fork to slide on the shift rails. As it does, the other end, which you can see on this one has overheated quite a bit, rides against some of these little collars in here. Here's a collar, and it forces the gears to go into the different ranges. So when that shift drum walks out, that means this whole shift drum has moved this way more than it should, because that bearing is walked out, which means that our shift forks also move this way more than they should. And then instead of, once we get it in gear, instead of that shift fork, kind of being neutralized and just kind of riding there, going along for the cruise, Well, it's grinding against that gear the whole time, and it's getting nice and hot, and you can see this one got kind of toasty. Look at the back side of it. It's all kind of tore up. Now, with this shift fork grinding against the gears, it's wearing, putting metal in the system, but it's also causing the gears to be pushed up against one another in ways that they shouldn't be once you're already in gear. Now, this one, well, we got away pretty easy. I'm not seeing any horrendous damage to the gears. You could probably get away with reusing these. I'm not going to. I have the means to go ahead and upgrade them. So we're going to do an upgrade. It consists of new shift drum, new star wheel, which we saw on the other side there, and I'll show you that when we go back together with it. New shift rails, all those shift components get replaced, and then my two gear sets here, they go like so. And as you can see, they're all different sizes. This one's bigger than this one, and this one is smaller. We'll see when I put the new set in, they look very, very different. And this is what I was talking about with that speed sensor. The speed sensor is mounted in such a location so that it's actually looking at, let's see, which gear is it? This one here. And so when I put the new set in, you're going to find that that gear is now going to be a much smaller diameter, and the sensor can no longer see those teeth. So we have to get our signal from somewhere else. When you do these projects, okay, so obviously I'm going to replace this retainer. I'm going to replace this bearing. I'm going to have to drill those out, try to get those out. That's going to be my challenge. Now, these shift rails are a slightly different diameter as well. On the 99s, they're a much smaller hole. You don't drill the hole out. There's actually a stepped set of shift rails you can get, or you can have a machinist machine them down. I'll show you those. I've got a couple of those I can show you. So on the 99s also, this area right here that's cut into this boss is not cut out. So evidently, as time went on, they knew that they were going to have to change the gears that they used. And so by 2000, they started notching this out. You're going to see that the new gear set, unlike the old gear set, here's my old gear set. Let's see, what does it go? Bolt side down. So it actually goes, it goes in here like this. And you can see that clearance down there, right there where my fingertip is, isn't even needed, but it will be needed on the new gear set. So that tells me that Victory knew there was a change coming, and they had already machined the case to accommodate the different gear set that needs to go into these. They probably had a couple of million of these sitting on the shelf they had to use up first before they upgraded to the next gear set. All right, the other thing you want to do is whenever you're doing this is you want to check your bearings, especially if you see any kind of metal in here. The instructions say you should replace or take apart the pump for inspection. And if you see damage, replace the oil pump. Oil pump has two sides to it. One side here sucks the oil up and pushes it through these tubes and pushes it through the filter. The other side goes into hollow openings in the case and squirts oil through this little nozzle here. This nozzle here is what lubricates the gear set. Now when we put the new gear set in, because they are a different configuration, this nozzle is no longer directing the oil in the right location, so we have to change it out and replace it with a different nozzle with a jet and a collar, as they call it, so that the oil is squirted into the gears more appropriately. So that's one of the other modifications we have to make. So we'll get that done. We'll put the new gear set in, the new shift rails and so forth. But my first nightmare is going to be, well, broken off bolts. And those of you who have had the challenge of removing broken off bolts, especially when Loctite was used, well, you know I'm in for it. This is going to be fun. got lucky while I was drilling. One of the screws, the drill actually drove it out and unscrewed and came out from this side. The other one's a little harder to get to. The oil pump's kind of in the way. I'm trying to avoid removing the oil pump if I don't have to. And something else we have to do on this upgrade is we've got to modify this plunger. It's a spring-loaded plunger. Here's the actual plunger portion of it. And it goes in this little sleeve here. And this applies pressure to the star wheel. Where'd our little star wheel go? So the star wheel rotates our drum, and it's indexed on the back. And so the little bumps there are what locks the shift drum in the different gear ranges. So that's what actually holds everything, holds those shift forks. Once they've moved the gear into place, it's going to hold it there. The shift drum's going to hold the shift fork, and this is what's going to keep that shift drum where it needs to be. Now, on the upgraded transmission, this star wheel, the points are considerably larger. They stick out a little further, so you get a bit more positive engagement. They can't really move as easily. But because they're slightly longer, this plunger actually does not collapse far enough to allow the upgraded star wheel to rotate. So one of the things we have to do, and if you were able to get the kit, it would come with a new sleeve and a new plunger, but they're pretty easy to modify. We're going to take the drain plug out, and we're going to take this sleeve out, and this little guy comes out pretty easy, and we're going to cut. We're literally going to cut between 1/4 of an inch and about 3/8 of an inch of metal off of both of them. We're going to shorten the plunger, we're going to shorten the sleeve, and then our star wheel can rotate just fine. Pretty easy to do. It's not exact science. We just want to make it so that it can move a little bit further down than where it is. If you're worried about spring tension, you can snip, a coil off the spring as well. The last one I did, I just left the spring the way it was, just made for a little firmer shift is all. So we're going to do that because by moving the sleeve out of the way, I can get to this other bolt better, and hopefully I can, drill it out from the backside and save myself a lot of trouble on the other side. We'll see how that pans out. And then, of course, we're going to knock this bearing out and put a new bearing in as well as retain it. So to get this out, I was thinking it came out this way. It actually goes out down through that drain plug hole. There's a bolt right down here. Hex head. That's what holds it in. Take that out. This can come out. You can easily cut it. I can get to my screw there. And then we can start going back together with this thing. There it is. That's just a plug. So this is a plug with a hex hiding a screw with a hex. So there's like 2 stages to that. There we go. It just falls right out. There it is. Alright, still fighting that other bolt. I drilled it from this side because I could get a straighter shot on it, and got all the way through. And I kind of surprised myself. I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but I actually got right down the middle of that bolt all the way through from the back side without any jigs or anything to hold it straight. So doesn't mean I'm going to get the rest of the bolt out very easily, but if an easy out won't get it, at least I'm centered and I should be able to drill it out. If I have to go a size larger, I will. In fact, I've done that in the past. Had to drill the bolt out completely, tap new threads, and put a slightly larger size bolt in it. So we're getting there. We're making progress. Alrighty, so here is the carnage. One screw I was able to get most of it out. This guy here. The other one, well, I drilled, and that's all that's left of it. But the bottom line is, we got the holes cleared out. I did have to go oversize. I don't know if you can see it. So this hole down here, I'm going to have to tap that out. I'm going to have to use a slightly larger screw, but that's fine. This one up here is fine. The threads are still good there. And even if that's a little bit bigger size, it'll still do its job. Actually, probably do it a little bit better. And then the bearing, well, I just gave it a little push and just fell right out. Wasn't in there real snug like it should be. Anyway, we've got a new bearing. We've got a new retainer. And I'm going to head down to the hardware store and get a couple of screws. And it's getting kind of late tonight, so I think we're going to call it quits for the evening here. We'll get the screws that we need. We'll get that bearing in, and then we get to start reassembling stuff. And I'll show you the new parts that we're going to be dealing with. So I guess that's it for tonight. So because I want to try and keep my videos, within people's attention span, try to keep them around 30 minutes, we're going to go ahead and call it quits for this video. So come on back for part 2. In part 2, we'll go ahead and we'll shorten that plunger. We'll change the oil jet. We'll go ahead and put that new bearing and the new bearing retainer in it, and we'll put a new set of gears and shift components in it. So thanks for watching. Come on back for the next episode.